Namaste sir, welcome back to Tantrādhva Conversations. So for this episode, let's continue our discussion on the evolution of Śrīvidya. From where we left off last time, you spoke about Charya and the yoga streams in the Tantric tradition. Could you explain how these two streams became incorporated into the Śrīvidyopāsanā krama?
Yes. When discussing the evolution of Tantra, particularly its later transformation and the formation of the Śrīvidya system, we must always keep in mind the two foundational streams, Charyapada and Yogapada. The Charyapada pertains to ritualistic external worship, while the Yogapada relates to inner spiritual discipline. In the early days of Tantra, Tantric aspirants or Tantric practitioners were known as Purva Kaulikas or Purva Kaula Sadhakas. But why emphasize Purva, meaning former or early? This distinction became necessary as the term Kaula evolved over time, acquiring different meanings in later periods. These later day Kaulikas were known as Uttara Kaulikas. The Uttara Kaulikas developed their own distinct practices, and over time, Kaula Tantra itself underwent significant transformations. There was an increasing emphasis on external ritualism, Charyapada, which led to a clear distinction between the original adherents and the later counterparts, that is, Purva Kaulikas and Uttara Kaulikas. Our knowledge of these practices primarily comes from Śrīvidya related works and commentaries. One important source is Sri Lakshmidharacharya, who is believed to have lived in the late 15th century AD in the northern regions of Andhra Pradesh. Sri Lakshmidharacharya is well known for his masterly commentary on the famous Saundarya Lahari. In his commentary on Saundarya Lahari 41st verse, he describes the Sri Chakra Puja as performed by both Purva Kaulikas and Uttara Kaulikas. I shall read the original and then tell you the meaning. Sri Chakra Sthita Navayoni Madhyakata Yonim Bhurja Hema Patta Vastra Pithadau Likhidam Purva Kaulaha Pujayati Tarunyaha Pratyaksha Yonim Uttara Kaulaha Pujayati Ubhayam Yonidvayam Bāhyameva Na Antaram. Here is the summary of his explanation. The Purva Kaulas worshipped Sri Chakra by drawing it on materials such as Bhurja Patra, that is birch bark, gold plates, cloth, or a pedestal. Their focus is the Yoni, that is the triangle at the center of the Sri Chakra. The Uttara Kaulas, on the other hand, worship the Stri Yoni, that is the actual female genitalia of a young woman. Despite the difference in objects of worship, in both cases, whether the yoni symbolic or actual, the practice remains external rather than internal. Further he says, Kaulanam Trikone Ananda Bhairavi Mahabhairavau Sampujyau Sadhaganam Tabhyam Tadatmyena Avasthanam. Furthermore, the Kaulas worship Ananda Bhairava and Mahabhairavi within the central triangle, Trikona of the Sri Chakra, seeking to gradually merge with them. He then goes on to describe the specific way in which the Uttara Kaulikas conduct their worship. Digambaratvam samashritya samarchayanti stri purushaha tatra sura mamsa madhumatsyadi dravyaihi samaradhanam Vāmācāra pravritya. In Uttara Kaula practices, men and women discarded their clothes and performed rituals in the Vāmacara tradition. These rites included the offering of liquor, meat, honey and fish, reflecting the Panchamakara system of ritual substances, though perhaps not fully in the spirit of Veera Sadhana. Atra bahu vaktavyam iti tattu avaidiga margatvat smaranarhamapi na bhavati. Tathapi dingmatram nishedhyatvena samayamata marga pradarshana upayogitaya uktam iti. Acharya says that there is much to be said on this, but since it belongs to a non-Vaidiga path, it is not even worthy of remembrance. Smaranarham api na bhavati. Nevertheless, it has been mentioned just briefly only for the purpose of highlighting its rejection and to illustrate the approach of the Samayamata tradition. So, now this account by Sri Lakshmidharacharya provides valuable insight into how external rituals evolved within the Kaula tradition over time. However, it is important to recognize that his description of the then prevalent Kaula sadhana is presented through the lens of early Śrīvidya teachers. His portrayal is not a neutral historical record, but is shaped by the doctrinal stance of Śrīvidya adherents who sought to distance their tradition from what they perceived as excessive ritualism and non-Vaidiga elements in later Kaula practices. His references to the rituals serve in part to highlight the contrast between the evolving Kaula path and the more refined esoteric approach of Samayamarga within Śrīvidya. As for Yogapada, it is uncertain whether the inner meditative practices of the Purva Kaulas underwent drastic changes over time. What kind of Yogapada meditative practices the Uttara Kaulas followed is not clear. However, it is reasonable to infer that the radical shift in the external rituals, especially the adoption of Panchamakara based worship, was a key factor in the emergence of Uttara Kaula sadhana as a distinct classification. Thus, it is reasonable to infer that the Purva Kaula Yogapada stream of the Tantric tradition played a significant role in shaping the early phase of Śrīvidya. And the Charyapada, which was originally marked as a tough Veera sadhana and which deteriorated later into Vāmacara, was completely rejected. The intense yogic disciplines of the Purva Kaulas were likely refined and seamlessly integrated into the Śrīvidyopāsanā krama, contributing to its structured and esoteric approach.
How did Śrīvidya evolve beyond the Purva Kaula and the Uttara Kaula stages of the Tantric tradition?
So, as Sri Lakshmidharacharya mentions, the Purva Kaula Yoga Sadhana spread to various regions, especially in South India. Over time, however, this practice was fine-tuned to align with the principles of what came to be known in later days as Śrīvidya Paddhati. The focus, we might say, shifted towards a more refined approach. The intense internal discipline and the use of the Sri Chakra were gradually integrated into the Śrīvidyopāsanā krama, making it more systematic and focused on inner spiritual realization. He refers to this tradition as Samayacara. However, it came to be known as Purva Samayacara later, with further development and shifts in this system, when the practice gradually shifted from being more internal to becoming more external in its worship. So in the Purva Samayacara, the worship of the goddess started to take a more defined shape, particularly as the Śrīvidya Paradevata, Śrī Mahatripura Sundari and the Śrī Chakra were introduced into Kundalini sadhana. This is where Śrī Mahatripura Sundari came to be worshipped as Kundalini Shakti, the inner energy that resides within the body of the sadhaka or practitioner and is awakened through intense spiritual discipline. Additionally, the Śrī Chakra is considered to be established within the human body itself, symbolizing the internal manifestation of the divine geometry that corresponds to the spiritual ascent of the practitioner. The Purva Samayacara practice itself was a Kundalini sadhana that worked with the Panchadashi Bijas, connecting them to the Adhara Chakras and the different Avaranas or enclosures of the Śrī Chakra, and also included the use of Matrikaksharas, that is, the divine seed syllables of the alphabet. Back in those days, this Samayamarga was a serious, intense practice, something the sadhakas, that is the practitioners, lived and breathed as part of their everyday life. And not only that, by this point, both the earlier Kaula traditions, I mean the older traditions of Purva Kaula and Uttara Kaula, were seen in a more critical light and ultimately discarded as practices not suitable for serious spiritual pursuit. Maybe the reason is that by then the original Veerasadhana with the Panchamakaras had completely fallen into decline, perhaps even desecrated beyond recognition. I shall just quote a verse from Subhagodaya Stotra, which is ascribed to Sri Gaudapadacharya as its composer. Ataste kaulaste bhagavati dridhaprakrita jana iti prahuhu prajñāha kulasamaya margadvaya vidah mahantas sevante sakala janani baindava grihe shivakaram nityam amrita jharikam aindava kalam. That is, these Kaula worshippers are considered Prakrita, that is of a lower nature, Dridha Prakrita Jana. Idi Prahuhu Prajñāha Kulasamaya Margadvaya Vidah. This is how scholars well versed in both the Kaula and Samaya Marga, the two paths, describe them. Mahantah sevante sakala janani baindava grihe shivakaram nityam amrita jharikam aindava kalam. However, highly evolved Samayacara practitioners worship the divine goddess Sri Tripura Sundari, who is the universal mother, Sakala Janani, Shiva Swarupini, and Amrita Jharika, Amrita Pravaha Rupa. She is worshipped as Kundalini Shakti in her lunar form, Aindava Kala or Indu Kala Swarupa, within the Sahasrara, which corresponds to the Bindu Mandala of Śrī Chakra. This is the meaning of this Subhagodaya Stuti verse. In other words, the practitioner awakens Kundalini Shakti as the divine goddess Sri Tripura Sundari herself, raises Kundalini upward to Sahasrara, merges that Shakti into Paramashiva, and worships that state known as Sadhakhya Tattva, aligning that Sadhakhya Tattva to the Bindu Mandala of Śrī Chakra inside his body. What is this Sadhakhya Tattva? It is a term from the Purva Kaula tradition, and it refers to that ultimate state when Kundalini Shakti reaches the crown chakra, that is the Sahasrara. Now, when that happens, something truly profound takes place. The sadhaka experiences a shower of nectar, amrita, that spreads throughout all the nadis, the subtle energy channels of the body. Now, this nectar shower is not just some poetic metaphor. It is a real experiential phenomenon described in the scriptures and by those great sadhakas who have actually undergone this awakening. In Sahasrara, there is what we call Bindu, the source of this nectar, which is associated with the lunar essence. When Kundalini reaches this point, it triggers the release of this ambrosial energy and it starts flowing downward, nourishing and energizing every chakra. And what is the result of this? A state of immense bliss, a kind of divine intoxication where all boundaries of the individual self begin to dissolve. The sadhaka no longer feels separate from the universe. It is like merging into that infinite presence of Shakti and Shiva in complete union. That is why this is considered the peak of spiritual awakening in the Purva Samaya Marga of Śrīvidya. It is not just about energy movement, it is about realizing oneness with the Supreme. It is the culmination of the sadhaka's journey where the realization dawns that the individual self and the Supreme are one. This is called Aikyānusandhāna. That is the realization of the essential oneness of the individual self, Jiva, with the Supreme Parashakti. This is what is known as Antarika Samaya Upasana. It is performed in a systematic manner, aligning with the Tithis, the 15 lunar days. The Subhagodaya Stuti gives a detailed account of this sadhana. Just to give you a sense of it, let me quote and explain a verse from Subhagodaya Stuti. Now, some of these details might sound a bit technical or even a little obscure, but I still want to share them so we can appreciate how seriously and systematically this entire sadhana paddhati was followed by those sincere aspirants of the ancient Purva Samayacara tradition. Kalayaha shodashyaha pradiphalita bimbena sahidam tadiyai piyushaihi punaradhigamapla chitatanuhu. Now, what does this mean? The Shodashi Kala of the Devi, known as Sada, manifests within the Adhara chakras, reflecting the 15 Tithis, the lunar days. As a result, an excess of nectar, Amrita, flows from the lunar sphere, that is Chandramandala, saturating the sadhaka's entire being. Site pakshe sarvas thithaya iha krishne epicha sama yadacha amavasya bhavati nahi puja samayinam. That is, in the bright fortnight, Shukla Paksha, this process takes place and the same continues in the dark fortnight, Krishna Paksha also, for all Tithis. However, on Amavasya, new moon, this does not occur. Hence, for practitioners of Samayacara, worship is prohibited on Amavasya. Going further, the text explains that the sun and the moon move along the Ida and Pingala nadis respectively. Idayam Pingalyam Charata Ihatau Surya Shashinau. As they traverse, there comes a moment when they meet and merge at the Mooladhara Chakra. Sa Titihi Ama. This exact conjunction is what is referred to as Amavasya Tithi, that is the new moon phase. At this point, darkness engulfs the Mooladhara, described as Tamasi Adhare, meaning the base center Mooladhara is enveloped in obscurity. Since the solar radiance does not reach the lunar sphere at the Ajna Chakra during Amavasya, the divine nectar ceases to flow, causing the nadis to dry up. This disruption in the nectar stream also affects Kundalini Shakti, as her awakening is closely linked to the flow of Amrita. That is why in Samayācāra, worship is strictly prohibited on Amavasya, because the very process that sustains the subtle energy movement is hindered on this particular lunar day. What a complicated process and how obscurely it has been explained, right? Definitely, without the guidance of a competent guru, undertaking such an intense sadhana is totally impossible. The entire Subhagodaya Stuti, consisting of about 50 or 52 verses, elaborates extensively on these intricate practices of this Purva Samayācara sadhana only. So, this practice basically involves Kundalini sadhana, where the 15 Bija mantras of Panchadashi mantra, along with the corresponding Matrika letters, are aligned with different lunar phases, tithis, various Adhara chakras within the body, and the Avaranas of the Sri Chakra. Moreover, the Bindu Sthana, the central point of Sri Chakra, holds immense significance, as it is where the divine presence of the Supreme Goddess of Śrīvidya, Sri Tripura Sundari, is realized. Thus, we can surmise that the deeply intricate and serious yoga sadhana of the Purva Kaula Tantrikas, along with the spiritual accomplishment it likely resulted in, drew the early Śrīvidya sadhakas to develop their own internal practice of worshipping the Divine Mother, Sri Tripura Sundari. They incorporated this into their system of worship known as Samayacara, which came to be known as the right-hand path or Dakshina Marga, which stood in stark contrast to the despised left-hand path, Vama Marga. As you may be familiar with, there are two specific namas, two names in the Śrī Lalitā Sahasranāma Stotra, Antarmukha Samaradhya and Bahirmukha Sudurlabha. The name Antarmukha Samaradhya here indicates that the Divine Mother must be worshipped internally with great seriousness and discipline. Samaradhya. The practice of worshipping her internally is essential, as she is nearly impossible to reach through external means. Bahirmukha Sudurlabha.
Could you elaborate on the development of Samayācara in the context of the early phases of the Śrīvidya tradition?
Sri Lakshmidharacharya, in his commentary to the 27th verse of Saundarya Lahari, says, Ye ye samayino yogishvara jivan muktaha samsara yatram anuvartamanaha sadakya tattvam anuchintayantah atmaikya pravanaha vartante samaya prakaro nirupitah. The great yogishwaras, who even while continuing their journey in this worldly life, remain immersed in the contemplation of the Sadakya Tattva, with their sole focus being on Atmaikya Bhavana, the realization of the self as one with the Supreme. And they get liberated while still living. They become Jivan Muktas. This is the nature of Purva Samayācara and how it is delineated. Sahamaya vartate iti samayah, which means that the Divine Mother in the form of Kundalini Shakti remains with me within my body at all time. So this Purva Samayācara is the worship of Sri Mahatripura Sundari as Kundalini Shakti. What is known as Mahayoga Samayi Saparya is the internal worship of Sri Chakra without external rituals as described by Sri Lakshmidharacharya in his commentary on Saundarya Lahari. He extols that this is the Samaya Puja. Samayinam mantrasya purascharanam nasti, japo nasti, bahya homaha api nasti, bahya puja vidhayo na santyeva. Hrit kamalayeva sarvam yavat anushteyam, daharakashajam nama hridayakashavakashe chakrasya pujanam. Idameva samaya pujetyahuhu samayinaha. Thus, Sri Lakshmidharacharya defines Samayacara. For Samayins, there is no mantra purascharana, that is the ritual repetition of the mantras, no external puja or homa. The only sadhana is Sri Chakra Puja within the space of the heart, known as Daharakasha, worshipping Sri Mahatripura Sundari as Kundalini Swarupa. There is no worship of any external object or even an image or idol of Sri Chakra. Idameva Samaya Pujetyahuhu Samayinaha. And this alone is called Samaya Puja by the followers of Samayacara according to Sri Lakshmidharacharya. And this is to be performed both in the Shukla Paksha, that is waxing fortnight, and Krishna Paksha or waning fortnight, except on Amavasya, that is new moon. That is what is referred to as the way of Samaya veneration, Samaya Puja. Samaya Pujetyahuhu Samayinaha. Therefore, Samayins are free from the efforts and difficulties involved in external puja, the associated rituals, and the gathering of materials required for it. Bahya pujanam tat kriya kalapecha tat sambadanayam klesho nasti samayina. That is, for the followers of Samayacara, there is no hardship in preparing or acquiring materials for external worship and its associated rituals. The other side, that is Charyapada or the external worship, also gradually became integrated into the Śrīvidya system over time. The earlier external worship of Kaula Sadhana, involving the 5 makaras, Madhya, Mamsa, Matsya, Mudra and Maithuna, came to be labeled as Vamachara or the left-hand path and was increasingly regarded as sinful. By this time, Śrīvidya had been fully adopted by the Smartha Brahmanas of South India, who continued their Vaidika Kriyas alongside. As observed by Sri Rameshwara Suri, Śrīvidya was reclaimed from the degenerated path of Vamachara and integrated into the noble fold of the Vaidika Marga. A distinct Kaula Upasana, separate from Srikula traditions and devoid of Panchamakara practices, can be traced in Sri Amritanandanatha's Deepika commentary on Yogini Hridaya. It states that Kaulas are those who integrate 5 sacred elements into their spiritual discipline, what is known as Shri Panchakam. Chakra Devata Guru Vidya Sadhaganam Aikyānusandhānam Kaulikartham Ityartha. That is, Shri Panchakam refers to the essential oneness of these 5. Shri Chakra, Devata, Guru, Mantra, and one's own self. That is, Guru, the guiding force of realization, Mantra, the subtle vibrational power of the Devi, Devata, the divine presence of the Supreme Goddess in Shri Chakra, Chakra, that is Shri Chakra, the sacred mystical diagram representing the cosmos and body, and Atma, one's own self, ultimately realized as non-different from Devi. These 5 are Shri Panchakam or the hallowed 5. So, as you might have noticed, this is how the meaning of the term Kaula underwent transformation as the system migrated to South India to get shaped as Śrīvidya.
So the Sri Chakra worship becomes more prominent in the later stages of Śrīvidya, right? But is there any connection between Sri Chakra worship and the internal meditative practices that are found in the Samayācāra tradition?
Yes, there is a significant aspect of Sri Chakra worship within the Samayācāra tradition, particularly in relation to internal meditation. While the Charyapada generally emphasizes external worship and rituals, this tradition integrates a profound internal practice where the Sri Chakra is visualized within the subtle body. The Yogini Hridayam text provides a method of meditation where the Sri Chakra is visualized within the body's chakras, that is, energy centers. These chakras, also called Adhara Padmas, that is, lotuses, are aligned along the Sushumna Nadi, the central channel of subtle energy. The text instructs the sadhaka to meditate on each of the 9 constituent parts of the Sri Chakra, mapping them onto the bodily chakras. In this practice, the adept begins meditating at the base of the Sushumna and gradually moves upward, visualizing different chakras along the way. In fact, it is not just a matter of visualizing or mentally picturing the chakras, it is about actually feeling them, experiencing their presence and position within the subtle body or Sukshma Sharira. You know, this kind of sensitivity comes only through rigorous yogic training. This sequence continues until reaching the Mahabindu, the final point of meditation. This moving meditation through these chakras in this specified manner is a unique feature of this tradition. The chakras are arranged in a specific order, beginning with the Akula Padma, a red 1000-petaled lotus at the base of the Sushumna. Above it are 2 more lotuses, one with 8 petals and another with 6, followed by the familiar 7 chakras, Mooladhara, Swadhisthana, Manipura, and so on, leading up to the Mahabindu at the crown. At the crown of the head, called Brahmarandhra, there is another 1000-petaled lotus, which serves as the point of transcendence. Now, an important shift occurs in the meditation process. Instead of merely conceptualizing and experiencing the chakras, the adept is guided to meditate deeply upon the kalas, the subtle vibratory aspects or the mantra components of the bija mantra, Hrim. As you may know, Hrim is the most important and sacred bija in Shakti Sadhana. This begins with the Bindu in this Hrim bija, that is the Anuswara that gently extends as in the sound of Hrim bija and gradually progresses toward final dissolution in Unmana. Unmana is the trans-mental state beyond thought, subtle and ever radiant, where the mind dissolves into pure awareness. This procedure of meditation of kalas is detailed in the verses of Yogini Hridayam. So, it is clear from everything we have just discussed that this is not something one can simply read from a text and practice. A proper Dīkṣā and the guidance of an adept guru are essential, as only such a guru can truly lead the disciple. Moreover, the disciple must also be sufficiently prepared and capable of receiving this guidance. This meditation, as I said, is more than just visualization of forms. Sri Amritanandanatha's commentary clarifies that each kala has a conventional shape and color and each is associated with specific deities who reside in the 9 centers in the Sukshma Sharira. Thus, the practice harmonizes the experience of mantra, yantra and deity, demonstrating how Sri Chakra worship is internalized within the framework of Purva Samayacara. So, while the external rituals of Sri Chakra worship belong to the Charyapada, this form of internal meditation, where the Sri Chakra is superimposed onto the subtle body, represents a sophisticated bridge between Charyapada and Yogapada. It highlights the seamless integration of external ritual with inner realization, which is a key feature of Śrīvidya practice.
So, sir, you've spoken about the early phase of Samayācāra, specifically Purva Samayacara. What developments took place in the later phase? And what is the current status of Śrīvidya as a sadhana marga? That is in today's time.
The gradual transformation of Purva Kaula Kundalini Yoga into Purva Samayacara of Śrīvidya Sadhana is an important development to consider. These two expressions, Purva Kaula Kundalini Yoga and Purva Samayacara, carry a lot of significance. Later, a significant shift began to take place. In the Purva Samayacara stage, the worship of the Śrīvidya goddess Sri Tripura Sundari was deeply rooted in her Kundalini Swarupa. But over time, this intense yogic orientation gave way to a more devotional upasana approach, and gradually the focus on Kundalini aspect began to diminish. So from that point onwards, the emphasis gradually moved more towards devotion, slowly drifting away from the original yoga-oriented path of sadhana. There may be reasons for this. First, the gradual absence of competent teachers as it spread very rapidly to various places in South India. And second, the increasing number of Smartha Brahmana householders drawn to this worship. The Supreme Mother Sri Mahatripura Sundari came to be known as the one goddess who not only grants moksha but also allows bhoga to her bhaktas. That is, material enjoyment meant for living in this world. She is bhoga moksha dayini or bhukti mukti pradayini. Vairagya is not the primary salvation tool for a householder who has the responsibilities towards his family, right? Today, Śrīvidyopāsanā has grown and spread into numerous sampradayas, and the Samayamarga has turned into a soft sadhana, merely retaining some of the glories of the Purva Samayacara sadhana in some symbolic or ritualistic forms. It is no more a deeply transformative yogic discipline. There is not much subtlety left. Even whatever is done as Antarika Puja remains largely within the boundaries of Bahya Puja only. One of the reasons I mentioned for this shift was the gradual disappearance of competent teachers. And how might that have happened? Well, all the Adhara Chakras are part of or closely connected to the Sukshma Sharira, the subtle human body. The Purva Samayacara Mantra Japa, which focused on the different chakras of this Sukshma Sharira, as outlined in the Subhagodaya Stuti or in the commentaries of Sri Lakshmidharacharya, is not easy to practice, especially in the later periods when even the gurus had become householders. Do you get the point? Today, the dhyana of Adhara Chakras is mostly sankalpa based, meaning they are imagined as some points located in the gross body. The intense yoga sadhana has been reduced to a mere symbolic manasika sankalpa puja. Let me explain this based on the commentaries of a verse in Yogini Hridaya by two acharyas from different periods, Sri Amritanandanatha of the 12th century and Sri Bhaskararaya, who came about 6 centuries later. The 138th verse in the 3rd chapter of Yogini Hridaya talks about the knowledge derived through the tradition, that is, sampradaya, by the prasara, the expansion of Shakti. For this verse, Sri Amritanandanatha comments, Shakter ichha shaktehe kundalinyaha saraha prasaraha, explaining that this Shakti's expansion is nothing but the ascent of Kundalini. He then elaborates on the Tantric Yoga Sadhana of the Purva Samayacara. Thus, what Sri Amritanandanatha describes is the Sampradaya Jnana of the Kundalini Vidya of the old Purva Samayacara Krama of Śrīvidya. For all these sections of Yogini Hridaya, Sri Bhaskararaya also provides his perspective largely in line with Sri Amritanandanatha's explanations. However, in the end he states, Yaha Shaktanam Kaulikanam Anubhavah Tat Purvakam Yatha Bhavati Tatha. That is, all that has been stated so far reflects the experience of the early Purva Kaulika Sadhakas. The term Purva Samayacara is not actually used by Sri Bhaskararaya. Instead, he notes that these earlier Samayis were called Kaulikas because they worshipped Kundalini, who is the Kula Shakti. So, essentially what he is referring to are the Purva Samayika Sadhakas, even if he does not explicitly use that term. So, even by the time of Sri Bhaskararaya, it is uncertain whether the Samaya Marga remained entirely rooted in Kundalini Yoga Sadhana. The process of Vaidika Valkarana, that is, Vedic adaptation or infusing Śrīvidyopāsanā with a more Vedic approach, must have already started taking shape. Today, the meaning of terms like Samayacara and Kaulācara has completely changed. What does Samayacara sadhana as observed and practiced by Sri Lakshmidharacharya mean? It refers to learning directly under the guidance of a realized Guru, practicing Mula Bandha, Uddiyana Bandha, Jalandhara Bandha and other intricate yoga mudras, thereby restraining the movement of the Surya Chandra energies flowing through Ida and Pingala nadis. When Pranavayu is pushed into Sushumna nadi under pressure, the knowledge of Shat chakras and awareness of the corresponding Adhara chakras automatically unfold. Because, as mentioned earlier, all these chakras, nadis and granthis are connected to the Sukshma Sharira, subtle body. For an ordinary Upasaka today, these aspects are not directly experiential. Over time, as more Vedic rituals and procedures were incorporated, Śrīvidyopāsanā became more Brahmanic and suitable for householders, shifting away from the older yogic sadhana path. Today, particularly in South India, what is termed as Samayacara consists of Manasika Japa, Nyasa practices outlined in texts like Parashurama Kalpa Sutra or Nityotsava, and then the external Sri Chakra Puja, Yajna and similar ritualistic practices. These are mostly symbolic and mere ceremonial observances.
I want to conclude this discussion with a question that often gets asked. If an uninitiated beginner is interested in taking up the sacred path of Śrīvidya, what would be your recommendation on how they can begin, if there is any study and practice that is needed as prerequisites? And are there any books that you recommend for beginners?
This is indeed a very important and timely question. But before I respond, I must clarify that whatever I say is entirely based on the guidance given in the Shastras and the wisdom passed down by the traditional acharyas. I will not be speaking from personal opinion or from popular modern interpretations. You see, in recent times, the word Śrīvidya has become something of a buzzword. Many people are drawn to it, fascinated by its mystique, often without truly understanding what it is. Some imagine that merely installing a Sri Chakra at home or performing a few rituals around it will miraculously bring health, wealth, and success, as if it were a panacea for all of life's challenges. But Śrīvidya is not a quick fix system or a tool for material gain. It is a profound spiritual discipline, a sacred inner journey that demands deep commitment, humility, and preparation. So, before a beginner embarks on this journey, it is important to understand what Śrīvidya truly represents and what is required to pursue it with sincerity. There is a well-known verse found in the Phalashruti of the hymn Śrī Lalitā Trishati, Yasyano paschimam janma yova shankara swayam tenaiva labhyate vidya Srimad Panchadashakshari. This means Śrīvidya, which is primarily the mantra japa sadhana of the Panchadashakshari mantra, is obtained only by that sadhaka whose current birth is the last, or more precisely, one who is approaching the final stage of their journey through the cycle of births and deaths, and who is destined to become one with Shiva himself. In other words, Śrīvidya is not a path open to all. It is bestowed only upon those rare souls who are nearing the end of the endless cycle of birth and death and are on the threshold of final liberation. That doesn't mean Śrīvidyopāsanā leads to instant moksha for all its practitioners. What this means is that by taking up this sadhana, one sets foot on the final journey towards Kaivalya, the return to one's true home, though not necessarily culminating in this very lifetime. This traditional understanding holds great significance in the Śrīvidya lineage. One does not simply approach a guru, offer some dakshina, and walk away with initiation into this most sacred path. It is not a transaction nor a ritualistic formality. Śrīvidyopāsanā, especially the initiation into the Panchadashakshari mantra in Samayamarga, is a gift that can only be granted by the Guru when there is divine sanction. Even the Guru himself becomes an instrument of the higher will. Parameshwarya kripaya Śrīvidya samprapyate yatha garbhe patatyatma na manusha yatnatah. Śrīvidya is attained only by the grace of Parameshwari, just as the soul enters the womb not by human effort but by divine will. This analogy is profound. Just as the descent of the soul into the womb is not something that can be engineered or forced by human effort, so too is the descent of Śrīvidya into one's life an unfoldment guided by divine grace. No amount of learning, effort, or aspiration alone is sufficient. There must be a deeper readiness, an inner maturity, a divine ordainment for this sacred knowledge to take root. Janmantara suhrudenaiva paravidya labhyate. Paravidya, this supreme Vidya, is attained only by accumulated merits of past lives. Thus, in the Śrīvidya tradition, initiation, that is, Dīkṣā, is seen not as a beginning, but as the culmination of countless lifetimes of inner evolution. It marks not the start of a journey, but the moment when the journey turns inward towards the self, towards Shiva, who is in Samarasya, perfect union with Paradevata. Therefore, it is the sacred duty of the preceptor to carefully choose a worthy disciple, for only then can the lineage continue in its true spirit. The proper transmission of the Sampradaya or Parampara depends entirely on this crucial responsibility. In his introduction to Tripuropanishad Bhashya, the great Sri Bhaskara Raya affirms thus: Yesham tu bahushu janmasu purvakandokta karmanusthana vashat chitta paripaka vishesho drudho drishyate tadrushan prati tu samyak parikshya svabhumika shanaihi prakashaniyaiva anyatha sampradaya vicheda pattehe. That is, those beings who over many janmas, several births, have faithfully performed actions rooted in dharma as defined in the Vedas and other scriptures, thereby attaining mental refinement, chitta paripaka, and as a result of that, develop a deep faith in the path of upasana, along with a firm desire to accept and follow it. Such devoted aspirants must be carefully examined and tested, and then gradually instructed in the method of upasana with clear explanations of its subtle intricacies by a qualified teacher. Only when Śrīvidya is revealed in this manner can the tradition grow and thrive through an unbroken line of disciples. Anyatha sampradaya vicheda apatehe. If this is not done, the tradition will quickly deteriorate and fall into decline. The Kularnava Tantra outlines in detail both the qualifications and disqualifications of a disciple in about 37 verses. It even devotes an entire chapter titled Guru Shishya Lakshanam, exclusively describing the essential qualities required in both a Shishya and a Guru, disciple and the preceptor. Kularnava Tantra states, Anarhe kulavijnanam na tishtati kadachana tasmat parikshya vaktavyam kulajnanam mayoditam. That is, if the knowledge of kula is imparted to those who are unworthy, it will not remain in them. Therefore, even if someone appears to be an excellent disciple, only after conducting thorough tests and careful observation, and only when fully satisfied with the disciple's qualification, can the secret knowledge of kula, that is the initiation into Śrīvidya, be passed on. There are many qualities and requirements expected of a guru as well. Again, Kularnava Tantra says, Swayam acharate shishyan acharye sthapayatyapi achinotiha shastrarthan acharyastena kathyate. That is, one who practices himself, makes his disciple practice, and explains the subtle meanings of the principles taught in the scriptures, such a person is called an acharya. An acharya is not just someone who teaches by words. The true meaning of an acharya lies in the depth of their own practice and their ability to guide others with clarity and authenticity. First and foremost, a guru is someone who follows the path personally, practicing the disciplines, rituals, and inner contemplations as prescribed in the scriptures. They don't simply speak about spiritual truths, they live them. But that alone is not enough. A true guru also ensures that their disciples follow the path sincerely. They provide the right instructions, the necessary discipline, and the right atmosphere so that the disciple too can grow in the path. This includes both outer observances and inner transformation. And most importantly, the guru does not just repeat what the scriptures say on the surface. They have realized the deeper, subtle meanings hidden in the words of the Shastras, and they are able to explain those meanings clearly to the disciples in a way that is not merely intellectual, but which transforms the seeker's understanding and experience. And I agree, it is extremely difficult to find a guru of this kind in today's changed world conditions. So, in short, a guru is one who walks the path, guides others to walk it, and unveils the subtle truths of the scriptures with experiential insight. That is why a guru cannot initiate just anyone who shows interest. The responsibility of giving Dīkṣā, the initiation into Śrīvidyopāsanā, is not something casual. A true guru must choose a disciple not based on how much he has read or how intellectually brilliant he is, but based on his inner maturity and readiness for the path. Without carefully observing and examining these inner qualifications, the guru cannot and should not make that decision. Because this is not a short or a superficial journey, it is a deep and lifelong path, and the guru must take full responsibility for guiding the disciple every step of the way. There is no fixed destination or end point that one can define and reach quickly. In Śrīvidya, the journey itself is the path. It is a moksha vidya, a path that leads to liberation. And for such a sacred and transformative journey, the disciple must be truly prepared and the guru must be fully committed. It is especially important for the preceptor to ensure that the disciple clearly understands the true purpose of this sadhana. Today, many aspirants mistakenly approach Śrīvidyopāsanā with the hope of gaining material benefits, overcoming obstacles and afflictions, or even simply to strengthen their devotion. But pursuing this sacred path with such limited aims leads nowhere. Such a profound spiritual discipline cannot be reduced into a tool for temporary results. When Śrīvidya is approached with these kinds of expectations, the practice loses its inner power. It becomes a directionless and a fruitless effort because the path of Śrīvidya is not meant for worldly gain. It is meant for inner awakening and liberation. For anyone who begins to feel a strong attraction toward seeking initiation into Śrīvidya, the first and the most essential step is deep self-examination. One must sincerely ask, what is truly drawing me towards this path? Is it pure longing for liberation, or is there some subtle desire, perhaps for power, recognition, or mystical experiences hiding beneath the surface? Again, I repeat, Śrīvidya in its essence is a moksha vidya, a sacred discipline that is exclusively aimed at the attainment of the highest liberation. Therefore, it is vital that the aspirant honestly examines whether there is any other intention lurking within, however noble it may seem. Any aspiration that falls short of ultimate liberation is considered siddhi pipasa, a thirst or desire for attainments or supernatural powers, and such yearning is viewed by the teachers as an obstacle to real progress. Let me quote an old verse here. Mokshaika sadhanam vidya Śrīvidya Paramarthatah dhyayet susthira bhavena tyaktva siddhi pipasitam kutilam sukati bhramsham sahankara sushobhitam anarthadayakam sarvam mahapatana karanam. The meaning of this verse is like this. The path that leads to liberation in the ultimate sense is none other than Śrīvidya, Moksha Vidya, Mokshaika Sadhanam Vidya. The great masters have strongly emphasized the need to continue mantra sadhana with a steady and unwavering mind, with susthira bhava, while giving up the craving for siddhis. Such cravings can lead to crooked motives, cause a fall from the right path, sugati bhramsham, intensify the ego, give rise to numerous inner obstacles, and ultimately result in spiritual downfall. Anarthadayakam sarvam mahapadana karanam. With this understanding firmly in place, one should continue with whatever spiritual practices they are already following with humility, sincerity, and steadiness. In due course, by the grace of Paradevata, one will be gently guided to the right teacher when the time is truly ripe. This is all that I can offer in response to your question. As I mentioned, it is based strictly on the authority of the scriptures and the teachings of the ancient acharyas.